Welcome to The Sensitive One. I'm Gina Susan Long, nutritionist for highly sensitive people, and today I'm going to be speaking with nutritionist Jennifer May, who is the director of Food Intolerance Australia, as well as Sydney City Nutritionist, where she supports many people with food intolerances and food sensitivities. Jennifer's approach is unique in that she helps people to return to a full and varied diet, rather than just avoiding problem foods. Today, she's going to give us some insight into how she helps people to actually regain food tolerance. Now, I have to say that as someone who has experienced multiple food intolerances, I know firsthand how easy it is to fall into the trap of permanent food avoidance. Food reactions can be really unpleasant and also debilitating, and it's natural to want to avoid them and the inconvenience they create in our lives. However, staying on elimination diets for the rest of our lives isn't ideal either, and can create more problems in the long term. That's why it's so important to have a health practitioner by your side who understands food intolerances and can guide you through the food reintroduction process. Jennifer uses IgG food intolerance testing in her clinic, and just to provide a bit of context, this is the testing that she refers to in the beginning of the interview. IgG testing is a whole topic in itself, and while we do discuss this a bit in the interview, I think there is a lot more to say about it. So I may go into more detail about this topic in a future episode. The main thing to know is that this test looks at the IgG antibody responses to foods, rather than the IgE antibody response, which is associated with food allergies. It cannot be used to diagnose food chemical sensitivities or FODMAP intolerances, but rather is used for reactions to specific foods that are not food allergies. I hope that makes sense for now. And with that, let's hear from Jennifer May, and I will see you on the other side. So Jennifer May is a nutritionist, and she's a principal of a clinic in Sydney called the Sydney City Nutritionist. Welcome, Jennifer. Thank you for coming today.
Thank you, Gina. It's a pleasure to be here with you.
I was wondering if you could tell the audience a bit more about who you are and the clinic that you work in.
Yeah, sure. So as you mentioned, I've got my Sydney clinic, which is Sydney City Nutritionist. So that clinic's been running for around 8 or 9 years now. Initially, I practiced out of a multidisciplinary practice, and then we went off on our own. And I also have my national organisation as well, which is Food Intolerance Australia. And the reason I set that up is because Sydney City Nutritionist just had so many people traveling from interstate to come and see me for food intolerance testing and follow-up support. And I found that I was doing a lot of consultations with people who really I felt should have had access to these services in their local area. I was quite surprised that people were willing to travel so far. So I really wanted to find options that would mean that I could still offer them testing, and we could still provide, obviously consultations are easy, particularly now we're all quite happy to do the video consultation. And phone, before that became popular, the phone consultations were quite well accepted as well. But the testing was really a problem, particularly in regional areas. So I wanted to set something up that allowed people from all across Australia, including the more regional areas, to have access to testing. And then, of course, the proper guidance moving forward from that as well, which is, I guess, what I was told was really setting me apart as well, that people were coming to me not just because they trusted my testing process, but also that it was the guidance for how to use these test results and how to move forward with this diagnosis, what to do next, which is, I think, the most important part of food intolerance management.
That's a really good point, because something I've noticed is that more and more of these tests are becoming available online, and people are able to do them at home. So whether it's here in Australia or overseas as well. And I'm kind of wondering, whether people are actually given that guidance of how to interpret the test results and what to do with them.
Yeah, there's a couple of companies that do seem to be doing quite a good job of, at least they have an option of including a consultation, and they have a team of naturopaths or nutritionists on staff. But I feel like it's still not stressed enough. So for me, with my test, there's a mandatory session included. Now, if people choose not to book that session, that's fine. I'm not going to turn up at somebody's front door and force them to meet with me, but they know that it's included as part of what they've purchased. So the fact that people recognize that they have paid for that means that they're going to uptake that session. And it's really interesting, actually, to hear the different misconceptions, and also just to be able to kind of workshop with them how to implement these changes. I can sometimes meet with somebody who it starts off the session, go, yeah, I think, I really understand the report was really good and I understand all of this. So these are the changes I've made. And then they tell me the changes they've made, and it's really excessive. And even though they've received a very clear report coupled with a guidebook that shows them how to interpret it, despite that, and despite being advised to do otherwise, they've really eliminated so many foods and made their diet so restrictive, which, as I'm sure you would agree, is only going to worsen their digestive health over time with the lack of diversity within their diet. So for me, I think the biggest thing that drove me to really make this the key area of focus in my practice was not just, my personal experience and seeing such a transformation of my own health, which, I'm happy to discuss with you. And that was, that was obviously a great motivator. But as I was working with people who had food intolerances, who had been tested, who had been diagnosed, even assessed and advised, and even seen practitioners multiple times afterwards, the standard management was continuing to be, these are your problem foods, remove them, off you go. And even when they were working with naturopaths, nutritionists, dietitians, they were continuing to eliminate foods for an extended period of time, even whilst doing other things, to improve their health. And even whilst following a healthy diet, these foods were eliminated, possibly unnecessarily, for a really long period of time. And of course, because this is quite a difficult thing to stick to, people would then fall off track and then get another test and find that, yes, the original offenders are still a problem, but now they have a new batch of foods that they're reacting to. And over a series of tests over, say, 10 years, I was starting to see people that would come to me for the first time, yet it would be their third or fourth test. And they were reduced down to such a small number of foods that they could now consume. And of course, there's different levels of intolerance as well, right? So in addition to the types of foods that we can pick up on a test, they would also have maybe amine sensitivity or salicylate sensitivity or FODMAP sensitivity, which of course we don't have appropriate testing for most of those. So again, that's further reducing the foods that they could consume. The person might also have religious beliefs or other beliefs that might reduce their food intake as well. People might be following a vegetarian, a vegan diet. So what I was starting to see as becoming increasingly common was people reducing their overall intake of foods down to a very, very small pool. And this was becoming really concerning for me because I thought, well, where do we go from here? Are you going to be placed on intravenous feeding only? Are we going to have this person on a drip? And that's the only way that they can get their required nutrients. And it's really sad to see somebody at that point because, yes, there will be cases where somebody has had bowel cancer, for example, and had, really, really invasive treatments for this, which afterwards they might be restricted down to a few foods due to the destruction of the digestive system. But for the average person like me or you who has food intolerances, there is absolutely every chance that we can reduce the sensitivity to those foods with the right protocol, which means that we can then reintroduce those foods, maybe not all of them, and maybe not at the level we'd like to be able to consume them. I don't think I'll ever eat a real croissant again, and I don't think that I'd ever go back to my teenage years of having gluten with every meal, for example. But, you should be able to see some reduction, at least in the volume of foods that you're reacting to, and also in the dosage or the threshold that you're able to consume each day as well. We should be able to improve that and reduce the symptomatic response as well. So desensitizing someone. And I just see that as so important.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a big trap that people fall into, that I've fallen into, where you just keep taking things out. And I think part of that is also the psychological barrier, where because you don't want to feel sick, you don't want to
Mm,
feel unwell, you kind of don't want to even risk it.
absolutely.
So that's great that you have a big focus on helping to reintroduce foods and not keep people on elimination diets, because I do think that is the one of the biggest traps that people
Yeah,
fall into.
completely agree. And when we see practitioners that are doing a very good job of managing and supporting patients with food sensitivities, particularly amongst certain modalities, I would say that nutritional medicine practitioners do a really, really good job. But I would say that there are definitely other types of practitioners who are much more focused on symptom relief, and who, from my experience with the patients I've seen, that even when they've supported patients very well and they've been quite thorough, their primary focus is still very much symptomatic reduction and then making sure that you're achieving your required nutrients every day, which is all well and good. But essentially, you're just making sure that a person's on a good multivitamin through their food and saying that nothing else really matters. And we know that's not true. We know that, for example, being on a low FODMAP diet for more than a month can reduce the diversity of the microbiome. Well, the microbiome is having a huge impact, not only on gut health, but also on the immune system, the regulation of the immune system, which is going to lead to, or rather is going to determine the response to the foods and sensitivity to the foods. We know that with FODMAP sensitivity, the primary driver of that is imbalances within the microbiome, right? So dysbiosis, the clinical term. Now, if that's the cause, and the low FODMAP diet then exacerbates the lower diversity of the microbiome, well, your treatment protocol is now worsening the issue and going to mean that that FODMAP sensitivity is always there and getting worse over time. So I think it's time. It's time now for there just to be a really big shakeup and for people to start focusing more on the therapeutic process that is so important for reversal of food sensitivity, and recognizing that food sensitivity is just a symptom. It's not a condition, it's a symptom. This is a symptom like many others. And yes, this symptom causes other symptoms, right? So it's very easy to write it off as a condition. But with the exception of lactose intolerance, which is an absence of the enzyme, which, there are genetic traits, with celiac disease, which is an autoimmune condition, with IgE allergies to foods such as peanuts and wheat and, dairy, some people, and eggs, which some people do suffer with, those are completely separate conditions. Food sensitivities, however, it's a developed condition due to imbalanced microbiome, digestive dysfunction, and an imbalanced immune system that has become overreactive. So if we recognize those things, which most medical practitioners do, if we understand those things, then why aren't we looking to treat those things, which ultimately can lead to then reintroducing the foods? Now, just like you, I have many, many, many patients who are very, very scared to reintroduce foods. And look, I'm not forceful with that. I always say to people, you do it when you're ready, when you feel your body's ready. There usually will come a time where you're feeling robust and strong enough for some time and you feel confident. And you're also a bit sick of having to be so restrictive as well. So that's a good time to start to experiment. But if there's a lot of fear around it, it often will result in a symptom because our mind is such a powerful thing. And it also, of course, stress, it will exacerbate every negative health condition. So if we are under stress due to fear of reintroducing foods, then that's just counterintuitive. So we would never do it at that point. I think the counselling around food intolerances and the reintroduction process is also really, really important.
Yes, absolutely.
And with food is such a different challenge because you cannot avoid it. So if you have a sprained ankle, you can exercise differently or you can not exercise, and that's fine. You can lie in a bed all week with an ice pack on and, it's going to get better. But with your digestive system, you can't completely rest it. You have to continue to eat. You just have to eat differently. And what's so different about this as well is when you're choosing to create a lifestyle change in any other way. So let's say, for example, I'm going to improve my sleep, going to get to bed a little earlier. So what does this involve? Well, every night I have to choose to, get ready to go to bed a little earlier, wind down, not stay up watching Netflix, not watch things that are stressful or too exciting, turn the lights down a little bit, get to bed and actually be ready to sleep a little earlier. And maybe, earlier in the day, I have to choose not to drink coffee. So there's quite a few decisions around that process of getting to sleep earlier. It's not just a matter of getting in your bed at 9 o'clock and choosing to sleep, right? That doesn't really work. There's a few other decisions you have to make. With food, however, it's more than any other change because you're eating multiple times a day. You have to choose what to eat, how to eat it, how much of it to eat, and how much time and focus to put on even the process of eating, let alone the process of preparation, right? So when we're looking at multiple food intolerances, which is the case for most people, you're now looking at a whole variety of different foods which need to be modified, which is going to change cooking times. It's going to change the complete ingredients list of a meal sometimes because that one ingredient being absent in the recipe now changes the structure and means that maybe 3 or 4 other ingredients are needed to replace it. So everything needs to be adjusted. And these are decisions that you have to make every mealtime, every snack time. And also, if you're then choosing to do it the right way, which is you're still trying to follow a healthy diet, and you also still don't want to feel terribly restrictive, you want to be able to have some indulgences, treats, then it makes it even harder again. So I think given that this is such a weighted decision and a weighted process of eliminating foods, which quite honestly most of the time the foods you've become intolerant to are your favorites, and there's a particular process as to why that is. But if you're suddenly finding that you're intolerant to most of your favorite foods and you're also trying to do the right thing and eat a healthy diet, it's not always easy to find those quick substitutes because the substitutes may be less healthy options, or they might be more expensive options than you can afford, or they might not be available at your local supermarket. So it's not a quick and easy process. So the counseling, the support, the having people around you is so, so important. And you won't necessarily get support from your family, your partner. People may mock you. People may undervalue the importance of this change and think, oh, we can sneak a bit in there. She's just being precious. I've heard those words, and it's really insulting to the person who's suffering, isn't it?
Yeah.
I'm sure you've experienced that once or twice yourself. And even in restaurants,
Yes. Yeah.
it's hard, isn't it?
Yeah. Yeah, it is.
And even when you go to restaurants and they have those alterations on the menu, you still are looked at differently sometimes when you have to ask, can I get this made with the gluten-free bread? Or, do you have gluten-free bread even? And, what dairy substitutes do you have? And can I have the cheese removed from this? Sometimes you're just made to feel like a bit of a problem. So that all of that has a big effect on your mental health. And I think the counseling to support the transition into that eating style, and getting used to those things is really important.
I think you're making such a good point there that there is such a big impact in terms of socially and going out to restaurants, and that this does affect people's mental health. And I like to think of intolerances as kind of an invisible condition. And I think when it comes to invisible conditions, because people can't see the reaction, they can't see how it's affecting you, it's not as easy to get empathy from other people and understanding, and they don't understand that it is a real thing, and they think people are being precious. Yeah. So, yeah, that having that counseling in place and that support from other people, even other people who have food intolerances, I think to know that you're not alone, and you're not overreacting. And there's a whole lot of other things we could say about what happens when you go and see a doctor about this.
Yeah, the doctor's a big one, isn't it? Medical practitioners in general. What always surprises me is that gastroenterologists are so completely polarized in their approach. They're either completely accepting of food intolerances and recommending the low FODMAP diet like it's a cure all, or they completely don't they don't believe in them like they're fairies, it's like it's not actually a real thing. And they just really make people feel like they're going in there talking about some sort of voodoo or magic. They don't give it any weight whatsoever, and there really is that polarizing effect. But what really makes me, I mean, I get referrals from some GPs, and, for me, when I see a person coming in who has been referred by a GP, it makes me so excited to think that, there are medical practitioners who are actually doing the right thing. And don't get me wrong, they're all doing their best, right? They're all doing the right thing to the best of their knowledge. But to recognize that there are actually GPs now who have undergone specific checks, got to the end of what they're capable of, and then have said to the person, well, listen, maybe you have food sensitivities, go and see this person and see how far you can get with that. And sometimes the people they refer don't have food sensitivities, but maybe have parasites that weren't able to be picked up by the standard Medicare test and were through the more advanced testing that we have available to us as nutritionists. But, there's also quite a few who do have food sensitivities, and it's just a game changer when you find what those problem foods are that are triggering those symptoms. Removing them is just the most fantastic thing, because it's not an overnight change, but it feels like it. Within the space of a couple of weeks, after years of suffering, all of a sudden you feel like yourself again. And that's so empowering.
Yeah, it can be very dramatic. And I have to say that for myself, taking foods out of my diet that I was intolerant to has had the greatest effect on my sense of well-being of anything that I've done.
Yeah, that's so good to hear. And really, I think that awareness is spreading now, isn't it? It's spreading. People are starting to understand that, yes, we are all different, and we do respond differently to different types of diets and different foods, and not one thing works for everybody. And there's a greater awareness of nutritional medicine and, modifying your diet to suit your specific needs, which of course is the crux of nutritional medicine, right? And I think as people are starting to become more aware of that, they're sort of waking up and recognizing that just because they ate bread and cheese mostly for their entire youth doesn't mean that these same foods can't be causing problems for them now. But there's still that huge lack of knowledge when it comes to the next step. I think as a society, we're very into the quick fix. And in standard medicine, we're still very much, this is the symptom, this is the treatment, the symptom went away, you're treated, you're done, which unfortunately then also nutritional treatments, so certain diets and even certain nutritional medicines, so certain supplements tend to be used in that same way of, well, if this fixed the symptom, then your problem is now corrected, come and see me when the problem comes back, and it just delays the whole process.
Yeah. Jennifer, I would love to hear about your personal experience with food intolerances, because I think the first time we spoke, you said that this is actually part of what led you into working with people who have food intolerances.
Yeah, that's right. So, not that I knew it at the time, but I was suffering with severe reactions to foods from a very young age. So, pretty much as soon as my mum started me on solids, I became unwell. I know she says that at the age of 3 was kind of my worst time. I just was very unwell. I was very fatigued. I had big dark circles around my eyes and a huge swollen tummy. So it was quite obvious that it was food related to her anyway. And she would take me to doctors, and the doctors would do their best, and try and see if they could figure out what was going on. But they had absolutely no idea. I don't think that celiac disease, there was even the awareness of celiac disease properly back then. So, I mean, there was no celiac testing. It was never offered to me or my mum. So
And you're from Wales, is that right?
that's right, yes.
Isn't it true that people of Celtic origin have quite a high proportion or prevalence of celiac disease?
Well, I haven't heard that. That's a really interesting statistic. I'll definitely look into that further. But I mean, I would believe it. I think that our traditional diets were very, very dairy based and very limited as well. And I'm talking many, many generations ago, of course. But we didn't really have a whole lot of variety in our diet compared to those who, of course, were on the Mediterranean. Wide variety of vegetables, wide variety of fruits. Knowing everything that I know about the microbiome now and how the microbiome of the mother passes on and determines the health of the child, and then of course that then determines the health of their child, and it continues generation to generation until it's corrected. It would absolutely make sense to me, yes, that there would be a higher prevalence of celiac disease within the Celtics. And just in Britain in general, to be honest, because, we're a dark country. There's long, long periods without sunlight. There's a huge vitamin D deficiency across the country. Our soil is quite rich, so we have that benefit. But most of the fruits and vegetables were things that were introduced. We didn't have a huge variety there. So, I mean, the UK is really known as having a much more unhealthy diet and lifestyle compared to many other countries. Even the healthier people generally have a slightly less healthy version than, say, the average healthy Australian. So, we definitely do a much better job of it here. The healthcare system, though, the advantage that I guess we had is that you have your one doctor, and your one doctor sees you until you move locations, basically. So, my mum was going to see the same family doctor and then, referred to specialists from that same doctor. The same doctor would have all of my notes. And I think that that's really valuable. And here in Australia, where we tend to see any doctor within any medical practice, and there's no history there, I think that that's becoming quite problematic as well, because a doctor only has so much time to gather their information within a session. They've got to stick to really relevant information. If they don't believe that food sensitivities, a person's diet, that their lifestyle is the most important thing, they're going to skim over that. So that was one great benefit. It didn't really help us at all, though. And, they didn't really know what to do. So there was no testing. There was no real support. She was just told to just keep feeding me bran, which she did, and only made the problem worse.
Bran. Okay, so this was because you were bloated.
Bloated, yeah. So they're thinking, and I was quite constipated, I believe, as well. So, and my mum would say that, when I would pass a stool, that they would be quite large, and she'd think, how is it this size for such a little person? So, but I was obviously getting quite clogged. So it had been there for such a long time, but at some point, a parent just gives up when they can't get an answer from the doctors, and when they're continuously reassured that everything is okay, and your child is healthy, and there are no answers. There's no medical conditions there. I think it's quite common for the parent to think, okay, well, I'm the problem. I'm overthinking it. I'm worrying too much. So she just carried on doing the best she could from there. And as I got older, I just accepted the fatigue. I accepted the bloating as the norm. And I don't think I even knew that they were there. I knew that my stomach used to swell up after every meal, but I didn't really give it any thought as to why. I knew that I found it strange that other people would appear to be excited and happy and have energy, but I didn't recognize that I was depressed and fatigued. I just thought that they were weird or that they were faking it. So why would you go to so much effort to act like you're so happy? Like that was the way I felt, because for me, the way I felt was normal. And it wasn't really until, well, I guess two things happened. The first thing that happened was, as a typical late teens, early 20s female, I decided that I needed to lose weight. I absolutely didn't, but most of us go through that silly stage as females. And the Atkins diet was really popular at the time, so I started following the Atkins diet. I didn't follow it strictly because I was still eating a lot of salad, and I would have the occasional piece of fruit, but I did cut out all breads, pastas, noodles, cereals, everything, biscuits, all of that was gone, and it was just now meat, fish, vegetables, fruit. So I guess it was an early adaptation of the paleo diet. And it was really interesting, actually. I lost a lot of weight, but my digestive system did feel quite different. And I noticed that I would feel different after meals, but I didn't really understand it properly. I followed that for a little while, gradually came off it, and gradually, the weight would start to creep on again. But I'd also noticed that there was patches of inflammation that I hadn't really noticed before because it was so normal. So swollen ankles, and particularly the stomach getting swollen again after every meal. I mean, I was in my early 20s, so there were bigger things on my mind at that point. I wasn't really that into my health back then. I wasn't like the healthy 18-year-olds and 20-something-year-olds that are coming through now that are much more health conscious. In my late teens and early 20s, I was much more focused on drinking and being up all night with my friends and doing all sorts of unhealthy things. So when I started studying nutrition and initially going through the symptomatology, diagnosis, and pathology classes where you're exposed to certain medical conditions, and I would feel like I needed to put my hand up for every single one and say, I have that. I have that. I would fit every picture of an unwell person. And yet at this point, I didn't feel unwell. I, again, accepted my normal as normal. And at some point, we started covering food sensitivities and celiac disease. And all of a sudden, I was thinking, oh my goodness, that is what's going on for me. So the absolute final point for me when I really found out what was going on was I'd really modified my diet quite a bit through being a nutrition student. It just happens naturally. You can't help it, can you? The lessons are just in your head constantly. And I was following a really healthy diet, but then just before this one class, I'd had a muffin. Now, it was a bran muffin with no sugar, only sweetened with blueberries. It was extremely healthy. And then I sat in this class, and my stomach was making the loudest noises. It was growling. And my teacher thought somebody was trying to be funny, She went, who is making that noise? And I was sitting there going redder and redder. It's me. I'm not doing it on purpose, I promise you. And at that point, I thought, oh, this is really starting to make sense now, because I can see that there's nothing else wrong with what I've eaten today, and then I started modifying my diet and doing the elimination diet, which was my first step. And, just determining what my issues were and gradually making those changes. But the transformation, once I started identifying problem foods, which luckily I removed gluten first, and gluten was my worst issue. And once I'd identified that, my transformation was outstanding. I mean, the energy was so much better. I previously would wake up after a long sleep and never feel rested. But again, I'd accepted that as normal. Thought it was normal to wake up feeling crappy, and needing 2 or 3 coffees before you'd feel anywhere near close to human and ready for your day. But suddenly now, I woke up feeling rested and my digestive system felt very different. And again, I started losing weight, yet I was eating more food. So all the pieces started to put together in front of me. It started to really unfold, I guess, that actually this was the primary issue all along. And had I just made changes in my diet much, much earlier in my life, I could have been happier, healthier for so much more of my life. But you persist and you just deal with what you've got. And I think you and I were talking about last time how when you're unwell and you've been unwell for so long, your normal is so normal to you that it's almost impossible to think of being any other way. And everybody else just seems strange for being different.
Yeah, absolutely. I think particularly if you've had conditions from birth or from,
Mm,
from childhood, that does become normal to you. And, it takes maybe studying or talking to other people or some kind of insight for you to realize that isn't normal, that
yeah.
it isn't normal to feel tired all the time and bloated or anxious even. And I think it's really interesting listening to your story. I don't know if this is what happened to you, but I think if you've been unwell for a long time, you sort of learn how to disconnect from your internal
Yes.
sensation. And that just becomes a way of life.
Yes.
And it's not until you start to feel well again that you can start to actually reconnect because you're no longer feeling sick.
Yeah.
So, yeah, it's interesting. I wonder how many people are walking around with that disconnection, not really feeling grounded in their bodies because it's uncomfortable.
Yeah, absolutely.
Ignoring things and getting on with it because that's what you have to do,
Yeah,
to get on with life.
absolutely. And I think that this isn't just in relation to food intolerances. I think across all of the Western world, even though we're supposed to be developed countries and we have great access to healthcare and education, I think and great food, of course. I think there's a lot of people who are relying on stimulants and suppressants and painkillers as well to get through their day that could be very easily treated with a much healthier diet and maybe a more personalized diet for them as well. And I think this is why I was so happy to hear that you were a practitioner of nutritional medicine as well, because I think people don't really understand what it's about. And nutritional medicine is so about personalizing for that person, but not just, this is you and therefore this is your diet, but actually this is who you are. This is what your health history is. This is what your health goal is. Therefore, this should be your diet. And that, of course, will change over time as well, according to the health state and according to the health goal, which is why I think for me, my view of food intolerances was never removal is the answer. It was, well, removal is fine for now, but let's work on treating this, and then let's look at rebuilding those foods and reintroducing them into the diet, which disappointingly, the low FODMAP diet was initially designed as a temporary measure to be for the reduction of symptoms and for those foods to then be reintroduced. And Dr. Sue Shepherd, who created this, I saw her speak, and that was exactly what she stressed. The low FODMAP diet is a temporary measure. It's sort of an elimination diet, really. And then you must rebuild the foods, reintroduce the foods, find that threshold, and ensure that there is a diverse intake of most of the FODMAP foods, the high FODMAP foods, over a period of time. But I think what has started to happen as that diet has become more commercially viable. I'm not saying that that's their intention and, that's why this change has happened, but just this is the natural consequence of something that becomes commercialized, I guess, is that it's so easy for people to just buy a low FODMAP recipe book, to buy the low FODMAP meals, ready-made meals, to look for the low FODMAP symbol, follow the low FODMAP app even. It's so much easier to do that than it is to do the corrective work. So people, again, follow that low FODMAP diet for years. And for them, it's like, well, this is the way that I'm going to continue to eat forever because that's how I have to manage my IBS.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'd love to hear a bit more about how you actually treat food intolerances. How do you, because people listening to this who have taken foods out of their diet that, are in the situation where they don't really know how to reintroduce them and actually recover from the food intolerances or get some relief from them, might be thinking how.
Yeah,
So yeah, what do you do?
yeah, great question. And I will do my best to answer it, but it is a tricky one because it is very much person to person, right? But essentially, what we need to do is we need to look at the drivers. So, in some cases, depending on the results of the food intolerance test, I might actually recommend additional testing as well. So, for some patients, I might say that we need to do, for example, a stool test. We might need to look at doing, say, a SIBO breath test. We might be looking at doing other testing, just standard pathology blood testing as well to look for certain nutritional deficiencies. If I'm particularly concerned, then I might also be referring them to a gastroenterologist to get the colonoscopy and the gastroscopy done as well. So for me, that I don't see a food intolerance test as like this magic bullet, if you like, or this kind of all-encompassing report. I see it as an indicator. So if somebody has a few foods they're sensitive to, of course, the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to look to remove or reduce those foods. And whether we remove or reduce is going to very much depend on the person, but also the volume of food. So how easily can this person remove the foods without actually ending up on an incredibly restrictive diet? And also, is it going to do any damage to their mental health? Can they afford to make these changes as well? Because depending on the types of foods and the volume of food that they've reacted to, this might actually become quite an expensive process to try and find substitutes. So, looking to make it as realistic and practical as possible. The other thing that will determine for me whether it's removed or reduced is the strength of reaction. So the foods test that we use mostly is something called the food print, and they do a great job of separating the foods that you've reacted to or haven't reacted to with a traffic light system. So it's really nice and clear. So the foods you haven't reacted to have a green color, and then the foods that you have a borderline reaction to are yellow. So, think of that like the amber, caution. And then we've got our red foods. And so those are the ones that there's an elevated antibody response. So some practitioners would just say, okay, well, all red foods must be eliminated. I don't work that way. For me, I look at it in context of the total level of reactions. And I also look at it in the context of what else am I seeing amongst the general population as well. So if this person has 3 or 4 reactions and they're only just in that elevated category, I'm not really seeing this person's food sensitivities that have been picked up here as their primary issue. If somebody has 30 foods that they've reacted to, well, this is an indicator that the digestive system is severely dysfunctional, and we need to look at other methods of testing and get other practitioners involved as well to ensure that they've got a good support team and that they're properly assessed to see what actually is going on. If there's, say, 10 foods, 15 foods that this person is reacting to, what we'll now do is we'll go through the list and determine which ones can be maintained within the diet at a lower level. So say, for example, the eggs going from daily 2 per day to now having 1 egg 3 times a week, for example, right? And this will be determined by the strength of the reaction. So within the food print test, we've also got the number antibody response as well. So we might see, for example, that a person has a level of 100 and something to, say, cow's milk and egg white. But goat's milk, sheep's milk, and egg yolks are much further down on the list with an antibody response of, say, 31, which only just puts them in that elevated category. So if I'm seeing that, then I know that the smarter move for this person is to initially focus on those foods that have a significantly elevated response of, say, 70, 80, 100. And those foods that are only just making it into the elevated category with a response of, say, 31, 32, whatever, then they're less of a priority. And then, of course, we're going to monitor how that person responds to that initial change. If it's not enough relief, then, of course, we're going to start to continue to move through those foods and remove further foods until that person feels better. So that's step one. Yeah. And like I said, I do interpret the reports in the context of what I'm seeing nationally as well, because I look a lot of these reports. So I'm not just looking at it on face value, but actually, based on what I typically see, is this a lot of sensitivities or not? Is this a high level of sensitivity compared to the average person for this particular food? Egg white, very common reaction. Egg yolk, much less common reaction. So if the person's reacting to both egg white and egg yolk, I would consider their egg yolk reaction to be more significant than the average person who has a lower level response. And I would say that that person definitely needs to avoid the whole egg. Is this all making sense so far?
It is. I have one
Yeah.
question. Does a person need to eat those foods that are being tested for on the food print test within a reasonable period of time in relation to doing the test?
Yeah, great question. This is so important. So we actually advise people that whatever comes up on the test is true for what you've consumed in the last 3 months. Now, there's two answers to your question, right? Because yes, when we're consuming a food regularly and we have a sensitivity to it, we can see that antibody response easily on testing. When a person has avoided a food for a significant period of time, there is a chance that it may not show up. The antibody response may not show up in the testing. However, I've seen people with celiac disease who have had strict elimination for 10 years or more still have antibodies. I've seen people with antibodies to foods that they've only consumed once over the last few years, and there's still antibodies there. So all we know at this time is the testing is more accurate for the foods that you currently have in your diet, and the time frame, the sort of window of opportunity for assessing there is what foods have been consumed within the last 3 months. So that's the general advice. So if you're about to get a test done, going out and eating a bunch of croissants the day before your test isn't going to mean that you have a more accurate assessment of gluten if you've been gluten-free for 3 years or so, right? However, the other side, the other answer to this question is that it's all in the context of how you interpret your report, right? Because if you're looking at this report as a black and white answer, then yes, you need to be consuming the foods. Because if all you're going to do is go, well, based on this, I'm intolerant to, say, eggs and dairy and broccoli, for example, but I'm fine to eat soy now, but I haven't eaten soy for the last 5 years. So I'll start reintroducing it now because there's no antibodies to it. The truth is, you don't have antibodies to it right now. So initially, you won't have a reaction. So it is a true response, but it's being interpreted in the wrong context. Because as you reintroduce the soy, gradually over time, you're going to develop those antibodies again. Because the original problem which led to the soy intolerance has not yet been corrected. If, however, you interpret it differently, so this, when I'm working with my patients, one of the things we go through is, out of this report, is there any foods that you've previously eliminated? And one of the questions on my intake form of my pre-assessment is actually, is there any foods that you've eliminated for 3 months or more for any reason? So I then know those results need to be interpreted differently. So why don't we use you as an example, Gina? Give me 2 foods that you haven't eaten in a really long time.
Um, well, one would definitely be wheat,
Okay.
and dairy.
Okay, great. So let's say we do the food print test on you now. I wouldn't get you to reintroduce wheat and dairy. I definitely wouldn't. We'd just do the test as is. Now, when we get these test results back, it's possible that you'll still have an antibody response. And what that shows is, despite long-term elimination, you still have sensitivity. Now, this would say to me that these foods are likely going to be really problematic in terms of reducing sensitivity and leading towards reintroduction of those foods. So they're going to be the last foods that we try. If, however, we tested you and we saw that there was little to no antibody response to wheat and dairy, I wouldn't be saying, you're all clear, let's reintroduce them. I wouldn't even be saying, let's challenge them and reintroduce them slowly. I'd say, okay, remember you haven't eaten these in a long time. That's what's allowed that antibody response to die down. However, you still have digestive dysfunction indicated by your symptoms. You still have other food sensitivities, which has been brought to our attention by this test. Therefore, we need to treat that first. After that, we know that we can now safely challenge wheat and dairy because you currently don't have that antibody response. And yes, it's possible that during that challenge, you will start to regain an antibody response again if the corrective phase wasn't successful. But if we do it gradually and safely and in a controlled way, then we should be able to find a level of that wheat and dairy that you could tolerate if there was no antibody response in that report.
And so what do you do in the long term? How do you treat the digestive problems and help to reduce the sensitivity?
Yeah, so initially, once we've got those problematic foods out, so an analogy that I use for this is think about a building that needs to be, what's the word? Not rejuvenated. Pregnancy brain is kicking in. What's the word?
Renovated.
Renovated. Thank you. So we're to renovate this building. Let's say it's the QVB shopping centre in Sydney. We're not going to keep it open. We're not going to have people walking through there every day. That's going to cause daily additional damage and be quite disruptive, also quite dangerous for them too. So what we're going to do is we're going to shut that building off. We're going to deny access, right? We're also going to put in place certain things to protect that building as well. So we might have scaffolding up, for example. We might have areas that are covered to reduce the effects of the wind and sun, etc., whilst we're working on it. Then we go in and we do the repair work. Then we open it up again. So this is the way that you want to think about the digestive system. Now, of course, with the digestive system, we can't deny access. We can't simply stop eating whilst we repair it. It would be nice if we had the availability to do that, like we do with broken bones, just stop using that area for a while. We can't do that. So what we do is instead we remove the foods that we know are problematic, and that has that same effect. So it's stopping that daily damage, daily destruction, which allows the repair work to be more effective. So that's one of the reasons that we're removing those problem foods. Then the next stage is where we're actually now working to restore optimum digestive function. Now, for this, of course, we've got to try and determine what this person's issue actually is. So a good case history is really helpful here. When did these symptoms start? If it's from birth, like me, for example, then we're going to look at, okay, well, what was the birth like? Was this person birthed naturally or was there cesarean birth? Was the mother given antibiotics during pregnancy? The answer would be yes for me. Was there any instances of the mum having, for example, candida infection during pregnancy, indicating further disruption of the microbiome? If we can see that that's the issue, we know that restoring and supporting an optimum microbiome in this person is the correction. We also know, because it's been lifelong, that it's now going to be a lifelong management in terms of that support. So for me, constant prebiotic, probiotic support, and then other things which also positively affect the microbiome, like eating a varied diet, lots of plant foods, different colors, those sorts of measures are really important for me. The other things that we know that support the microbiome, for example, are things like getting outside, less exposure to environmental allergens. I'm not doing such a good job of that, having 3 cats and being highly allergic to them. But, these sorts of things we know are important too. Exercise, very important. So we would aim to try and correct those things. For yourself, though, where this happened with surgery, this can be much more problematic. I would still say it's highly likely that the microbiome was again part of the problem there. With anesthetics, there's a big impact there.
I did have probably have food intolerances from birth as well,
Aha.
because I had an intolerance to the formula that I was given. So it was a dairy formula.
Ah,
But I also was an eczema baby, so I'm sure I also had that issue with the microbiome, and
yeah.
there were things that exacerbated it later. So you're right.
There we go. So the microbiome started as a problem, which was less problematic as a child with much more manageable conditions. I mean, eczema's awful, but it's relatively manageable. Then you have that big exacerbator of the surgery, which is quite invasive and disruptive to the microbiome. And then we see this big flare up. So these are the types of things that we're trying to determine. If a person has salicylate allergy, so for example, I've got a salicylate intolerant patient at the moment, this all happened after her doctor put her on daily aspirin. So, that daily dose of salicylates was just too much for her body to handle, and it resulted in her reacting to the smaller amounts of salicylates in foods. So, these are the sorts of things. The case taking is really, really important. Just winding it back step by step. What was going on before this all happened? Now, sometimes this isn't possible. Sometimes a person is just really unsure of when these problems occurred and stuff, what was the initiating factor. And also, to be honest, sometimes people are just unaware. They just gradually decline into poorer and poorer health. And so they're just like, I don't know. I've kind of ended up in this place, and I don't really know what started it off. So in that instance, it's a lot harder. And then we've got to do just the general rehabilitation program. But whether we know the specific step-by-step process and the specific drivers of a person, or whether it's general rehabilitation it is for that next step. For rehabilitation of the digestive system, we want to make sure, of course, that we're supporting the microbiome. And if the person has the ability to do microbiome testing, which of course there's several levels of, there's the cheaper version, which just assesses the parasites and yeasts and things, and just a few of the healthy microbes. And then it goes all the way up to the really fancy ones that are incredibly expensive that test every strain. But if they have the ability to do the testing, that's fantastic. And that will really, really help then to determine what probiotics are going to be beneficial for this person, what prebiotics will be better tolerated as well. And that can, of course, make things a little easier. So probiotic, prebiotic support is going to be important. Now, it's important that I say right here for all the listeners that every probiotic has a different action in the body. So a probiotic is not just a probiotic. You can't just go and pick up a probiotic and go, well, I know that I'm on the right track. There are multiple different strains, and each one is important for different things. So a good nutritionist will usually be able to direct you towards which one is helpful. But if I was to say the best ones that are available off the shelf that work well for the average person, Inner Health Plus, fantastic formula. If you're very dairy sensitive, they do have an Inner Health Plus dairy free. Inner Health Gastro Relief can be really good. And I actually often use those two combined. And the parent company that makes Inner Health supplements, Metagenics, they also make these two formulas slightly adjusted in a practitioner range that are a little stronger as well. And so I tend to use those quite consistently with my patients. For those who are more sort of FODMAP sensitive, then the Inner Health IBS Control is also a really, really good one as well. And that can help to reduce a lot of the inflammation and the reactivity. But what we're ultimately looking to do is to improve the diversity of the microbiome. So the prebiotics are really important, and not everybody tolerates every type of prebiotic. So this is where it can get really tricky, trying to determine which one is going to be best. Where we can use prebiotic foods, which of course all of the high FODMAP foods are prebiotic foods. So for those who are FODMAP sensitive, this could be tricky. Those who aren't, then we use fermented foods, vinegars, even things like olives. I actually wrote a 12-week food intolerance recovery program, which incorporates these sorts of this sort of advice, but in a step-by-step way. And the reason I said at the beginning of this that I'll try and give you the process is because even with this program that I pre-wrote, every week has a way for you to assess yourself, therefore determining what the right step is for you and whether you should move on to the next step and which bit of advice out of week one you should actually take, for example. Then you move on to week two, you challenge certain things. From that, we then determine. So, and from this step-by-step program as well, we also are kind of working through the available options for treatment and finding which one was most effective. So for some people, we'll do the prebiotics, the probiotics. We're also looking to support, for example, digestive enzymes, which we'll do through foods. So incorporating lots of bitter foods into the diet, incorporating certain foods that have digestive enzymes that are tolerated by the person. For example, kiwi fruit, papaya, pineapple, these sorts of foods, if tolerated, can be really effective. So, we'll incorporate those as well. We'll also look to support stomach acid production. So, we'll get the person to do a home assessment to try and determine if that's a problem for them. If it is, then we'll look to incorporate more foods that support stomach acid production, and also in some cases maybe supplement the stomach acid as well if it's really quite poor, if the stomach acid levels are quite low and don't correct naturally. We're also looking, of course, to sort out the immune system. So for the immune system, we need to look at what you'd call, I guess, immune modulators. So things like mushroom extracts are really, really good for this. And some people will actually see quite a good response from incorporating certain mushrooms as well. So some of the Asian mushrooms, like the shiitake, for example, people will just incorporate those through their diet, but not everybody can tolerate that. So, again, it's about finding those things that will work with the person.
So it's basically supporting the immune system, supporting digestion, ultimately just supporting all the systems in the body and including the microbiome
Yeah,
and the mucosa so that that person is no longer hypersensitive to foods
exactly.
and is able to digest them better in the case of things like FODMAPs.
Exactly. I mean, if you look at FODMAPs, for example, sometimes people are just reacting because FODMAPs are high fiber foods, most of them. And if that person's deficient in bifidobacterium, they're not going to be able to digest those high fiber foods. So we're going to assume there's a FODMAP sensitivity when actually it's just a bifidobacterium deficiency. So this is where the testing we have available at this time is really helping, but also why I think that just because something was a solution at one time shouldn't mean that you stop your investigation and just kind of accept that as the treatment. The symptom's gone away. So therefore, I think we need to look deeper and we need to look at trying to correct. Because in that instance, that's something that's very easily reversible by taking a supplement of bifidobacterium every day. And now you can digest the FODMAP foods.
In pregnancy, I've heard that many women find their food intolerances dissipate a bit.
Yes. A lot of people have said this actually. I really discourage playing around with this because there's no research into food intolerances in pregnancy, but there's a lot of research into celiac disease undiagnosed and pregnancy, and increased miscarriage risk. So, I mean, within the medical community, I mean, celiac disease obviously is a much, much more serious condition, of course, right? We cannot compare celiac disease to food sensitivity because it is an autoimmune condition. There's much more severe to the digestive tract when a celiac is exposed to gluten, even a minor amount just from cross contamination compared to the average person who's just gluten intolerant. So, we cannot compare those two and say that they're similar in any way, of course. But knowing that there is a link between a food sensitive condition, let's say the celiac disease, and increased miscarriage risk, I just don't see that as something that is worth playing around with something so sensitive as pregnancy. So for me, any of my pregnant patients, and also for myself through my pregnancies, I'm actually more cautious during that time. So I wouldn't be able to say whether I've experienced a decrease in sensitivity because I'm definitely a lot more cautious to avoid, particularly my most problematic food, which is the gluten. For my other problematic foods, I've managed to decrease sensitivity significantly to the point that I'm basically asymptomatic now.
Okay, so you don't have symptoms.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So, there's certain foods that I know I have a dose dependent response to at this point. So, for example, dairy, dairy was one of my strongest cravings during my last pregnancy, but I didn't give in to it because I know that if I do increase my consumption of dairy, then that will cause only allergic rhinitis symptoms. So, the blocked nose, the sneezing, itchy eyes, things like that. But that then also increases my sensitivity to environmental allergens. And I have a dust mite and cat allergy. We have 3 cats here. So, because of the link between, the overall histamine response and the histamine increasing due to exposure to any allergen, anytime I'm exposed to my food sensitivities, my sensitivities to my other allergens do tend to increase. So, throughout pregnancy, I keep my dairy consumption low. I completely avoid gluten. And those are really my only 2 problematic foods at this point. So, dairy, I could have some cheese. I could have maybe a slice of cheese, a tablespoon of cheese within a meal. I can have butter because of the very, very low protein content. I can have a spoon or 2 of Greek yogurt. The full fat stuff really agrees with me best. But if I was to have, for example, yogurt with my breakfast and then some cheese with lunch and dinner, and particularly while I was quite a strict pescatarian, I would use dairy to sort of prop up my protein, before I'd recognize that there was a sensitivity there. So earlier in the day, I would feel quite well. And then as my dosage, if you like, of the dairy would increase throughout the day, I'd gradually start getting the blocked nose and headaches and just feeling a bit cloudy and foggy, as most people do with hay fever. So from decreasing that now down to just 1 to maximum 2 doses in a day with moderate doses of that, so really talking about the 1 to 2 tablespoon size, that is enough for me to not then see any symptoms of sensitivity. And that's about the maximum that I would allow myself during pregnancy.
Okay, so you give yourself you have a threshold, you know what the threshold is, and you stick to that.
Yeah, exactly. And that's what I encourage with my patients is that we don't just eliminate and stay on lifelong elimination. I really don't see that as a beneficial thing to do. But instead, I actually encourage that we go through the initial period of either elimination or significant reduction because we do want that antibody response to naturally reduce. And then after a period of time when there has been a significant improvement in symptoms. And we know that we've addressed certain factors as well. So we have supplemented with probiotics. We have ensured that there's a healthy diet throughout. We have made sure that the person's general well-being, sleep, for example, is all taken care of as well. And then we start to re-challenge foods to determine their dose-dependent response or threshold, as you very, very well put it. That's a very good way to explain it, that there is an upper limit or a threshold for that person to consume before they start seeing symptoms. And when I say seeing symptoms, I'm very cautious to ensure that everybody recognizes that seeing a symptom is not waking up feeling absolutely exhausted, almost hungover, feeling shocking, like you've been out on a big night of drinking. That's not what we're looking for. We're looking for any initiation of a symptom that indicates less health, let's say, for example. So that could be a mild headache. It could be feeling less motivated and slightly more fatigued. It doesn't have to be severe fatigue. It can be mild or moderate bloating, a little bit of reflux. Of course, we usually look out for those symptoms that the person previously did experience. That's usually quite helpful that we have a list of symptoms that they came in with, so we can look for those symptoms. But even if you, for example, presented to my clinic with constipation, reflux, and let's say depression and fatigue, and then after a period of elimination, when you challenged your foods, none of those presented, but you noticed that you had a persistent headache, I would consider that, even if it was a mild headache, I would consider that to be a significant symptom. And I would say, okay, we need to take that dosage even further down so that your threshold would be considered to be below the point that causes that headache. I would want you to still feel at your best whilst consuming that food. Otherwise, that food's not allowed back in. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that does make sense. Something I wanted to ask you about before we finish, Jennifer, is you wrote an article comparing different tests, and you
Mm,
were comparing the IgG food print test, I believe, that you use, as well as something called the hair test.
hmm.
As I said, there's a lot of tests available online these days for food intolerances, and the hair test is one that's become more popular or common in the last few years. And I think it basically involves just taking a piece of somebody's hair, and I'm not sure how they do the test, but it's tested against a number of different foods. You actually did an experiment with this, didn't you?
I
And
did.
I'm wondering what your results were. What do you think of that test? Do you think it's valid, or do you think that it's not helpful?
Yeah, so we actually tested two different types. So I won't mention company names because I don't like to name and shame, but there was one that was a kinesiology style test, as it was touted, which was completely bogus. And then there was another test, both of them hair tests, I should say. And then there was another one that was, yeah, like as you say, you send off your hair sample, and then they're supposed to be testing it against certain allergens. Now, for both of them, what we actually did is we sent off the same hair sample from the same person, but under two different profiles, so two different names, two different date of birth, etc. So it appeared to be two completely different people, which I have to say, one of the companies completely berated us for. Apparently, we were the ones who did something wrong by sending it off and testing it in this way. I'd be happy for anybody to test my tests in this way. I think it was a smart move. Um, but yes, so that's what we did. And in both cases, with both companies, the results were completely different. Now, the kinesiology style hair test was actually one where the practitioner would buy the machine, and with using that machine, you then place the hair sample on, and then that would go through a reader, and then it would give you a fantastic looking report, which would give you all sorts of advice, not just the foods that you're sensitive to, but the foods that are good for you, nutritional deficiencies, chemical sensitivities, all sorts of things. Now, I don't understand anything about how kinesiology works, but I know it does. But this test is just a completely bogus test. And so for this one, it made me quite angry actually, because I assumed that the machine was broken. And so when I contacted the company and said what had happened, I expected them to come back with, oh, no, we're not sure how this would happen. Maybe try this or this, or we'll send you a replacement. But that's not what happened. Essentially, they just argued with me, told me that I was in the wrong for testing it in this way, and that unless I understood quantum physics, I wasn't going to understand why the results were different. But the results were so different that in one report, it would tell me that I was sensitive to certain foods. And in the next report, it would tell me that those foods were beneficial for me. So, really, really, really has the opportunity to do a lot of damage here. And it made me quite upset to see that, this was actually being used, and that even the people who were selling this test, the person who I had recommended it to me was somebody who I quite respected within the industry. She's quite well known. And, through this process, I obviously determined that not only was she selling something that didn't work, but that she stood behind it when it was identified to her that it didn't work. And there was absolutely no doubt for her. There was no moment of, oh, well, maybe you did it incorrectly or anything like that. It was just, no, that's just because you don't understand quantum physics. And I'm sorry, but I don't understand how my TV works. I don't need to. If I press a certain number, the remote takes me to that channel. This is how I see food intolerance testing. The patient shouldn't need to know what they're doing. They should just turn up, have their blood sample taken, and get a result that is reproducible. It's all about the reproducibility. So the other hair test was very similar, except there wasn't so much aggression in the response. It was just, oh, well, we'd be happy to retest again for you. But by this point, I mean, I already had my doubts about hair testing anyway. From everything that I know about biochemistry, I know that it's not really possible to assess food intolerances via the hair. With blood testing, we're looking for something very specific. We're presenting an antigen, the component of the food that you're reacting to, and we're watching for the antibodies to respond to that. And if your antibodies are present in your blood, they'll respond. This works exactly the same way as how we test to see whether somebody is immune to a condition or has a condition. It's exactly the same test as you have when you're doing your STD checks, for example, or checking after vaccination to see what vaccinations have been done. It's the exact same test. We're looking for specific antibodies, and there's no difference in the process. So that process, the blood testing, makes absolute sense to me. The elimination diet makes absolute sense to me because you're removing possible triggers, watching for an improvement, then challenging that by reintroducing them and seeing if there is an initiation of symptoms. The hair testing, what are they testing? Like you said, what's the process? And nobody has ever yet tried to offer the science behind it to explain. And when you do the tests and you get these sorts of results and you challenge them with it, they're not willing to offer any viable explanation as to why that would happen or any reassurance that it won't happen again.
Yeah, thank you so much for clarifying that, because I hate that people are potentially being given incorrect information about these kinds of tests, and the people that are offering the test are perhaps not being as transparent as they should be about what the test actually does.
Yeah, and actually I got into a discussion with a practitioner about this quite recently. And again, she got just as heated as the company had when I initially brought up this issue. And she just defended and defended and defended, but without any actual explanation. Anybody could ask me about anything, and unless I can actually explain something, I'm not going to recommend it, you know? And the other thing is I need to know that it's reproducible as well. So we don't necessarily have to know the complete scientific background, but we need to be able to test it and know that it's reproducible. So again, I don't know how my TV remote works. I don't need to, because every time I press certain buttons, it goes to the same thing. That's all I need to know. So if I've got something that's that reliable, I'm happy to incorporate that.
Yeah, and I guess at the end of the day, I'm sure you feel the same way, that I would never want to recommend a test to somebody that I wouldn't use myself
No,
and that I can't fully advocate and stand behind.
definitely not.
And yeah, to be able to stand behind that what you're doing works, and that you would use it yourself and for your family.
Yes, I agree.
So I think we'll end it there, because I know we've gone a little bit over time. But thank you so much for having this conversation with me, Jennifer. It's always lovely to speak to you. Thank you so much for your openness and for just sharing your knowledge.
Thank you, Gina. Likewise, I really enjoy speaking with you as well. And I know that you have such good intentions behind what you're doing here, and that you're presenting this podcast coming from a place of somebody who has suffered and who has found relief. And so you've seen it from both aspects. And I know that you've had both negative and positive experiences within the industry as well. And you're looking to really kind of make this a much more open forum for people. And I think it's great what you're doing. I think this is such important work you're doing here. People need to know this stuff.
I hope you found this interview informative and helpful wherever you are in your food sensitivity journey. In the next episode, I will be speaking with young author and dietetic student Gabrielle Zimmerman. Gabrielle's life changed when she developed celiac disease and food allergies at a very young age. In our interview, we talk about the kind of challenging experiences that come with living with and even just getting a proper diagnosis for food reactions. We also discuss her book, When Food Can Kill You, which she wrote to raise awareness about people living with severe food reactions. Gabrielle is such a wise and passionate young woman who I just love listening to. So I highly recommend that you join me. Take care for now, and I hope to see you next time.